That's the one and only Stevie Nicks, whose songs have touched the lives of millions. She's a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee twice over. But as Tracy Smith found out, this music legend isn't resting on her laurels.
She was the earth, Stevie, the storm. For decades, Christine McVie and Stevie Nicks stood side by side, two women holding the center of a band, tearing at the edges. But behind the harmonies and smiles was a bond far more complicated than fans ever knew. Was their sisterhood ever as unshakable as it seemed? From backstage distance to songs born from private stings, what Stevie finally shares pulls back a curtain on something far more personal than any love triangle. And one moment, quiet, overlooked, may have changed everything. Rumors say the silence said more than any scream. And Stevie, she remembers it all. The sisterhood behind the songs. When Fleetwood Mac introduced Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie to the world, it wasn't just adding two voices to a legendary rock band, it was unveiling a rare musical sisterhood. At a time when the rock scene was overwhelmingly male, Stevie and Christine stood shoulder to shoulder as the band's feminine core, not only contributing iconic harmonies, but also symbolizing a form of unspoken strength. Their bond was never about flashy displays of affection. Instead, it was grounded in mutual respect, creative support, and a quiet understanding of what it meant to survive and thrive in a volatile, male-dominated environment. Together, they carved out space for each other and for themselves in a band riddled with personal chaos and ego clashes. Musically, Stevie and Christine could not have been more different, and yet it was precisely those differences that enriched Fleetwood Mac's signature sound. Stevie's writing was steeped in mysticism and metaphor, conjuring moonlit imagery, poetic heartbreak, and spiritual longing. Christine, on the other hand, wrote with a grounded clarity, her lyrics straightforward, her melodies crisp, and her emotional palette more pragmatic than ethereal. Where Stevie leaned into the abstract, Christine embraced the accessible. This contrast was never a source of public conflict. Instead, it served as a yin-yang balance that kept their music both imaginative and relatable. While they rarely collaborated on songwriting directly, their contrasting voices in the same track list created a dynamic duality that defined the band's most legendary albums. In the context of Fleetwood Mac's internal dynamics, their bond was placed under pressure by an emotional minefield. Christine was often the stabilizing force surrounded by the chaos of romantic entanglement and interpersonal feuding, especially with the legendary cracks between Stevie and Lindsey Buckingham. In fact, these two women hardly ever came out in the open about any conflict towards one another, always acting as a shield against other members of the band, publicly or otherwise, when they exploded in feuds. Interview comments over the years from both ladies showed an ever-so-slight but stable theme. They kept each other's backs. They, as a united front, became righteous about a lot of backstage issues or media narratives and, thus, saved their personal dignity amidst the chaos. However, this unity comes at a cost, especially when emotional labor is placed unequally on women's shoulders. Although they rarely voiced it, the continuous performance of sisterhood under high-pressure situations would have caused cracks in the very foundation of their friendship with themselves. Their friendship endured but sometimes found itself on uncertain grounds. Stevie would later reflect on how maintaining closeness in such a fractured environment sometimes meant biting her tongue or pushing her own needs aside. Even the strongest bonds can start to splinter when one voice begins to echo louder than the other. Rivalry and rising fame. By the time rumors exploded onto the charts in 1977, Stevie Nicks had become the magnetic face of Fleetwood Mac. Her image, flowing shawls, platform boots, and mystical lyrics, captivated the public imagination in a way few rock performers ever had. Songs like Dreams, which Stevie wrote, became emblematic not just of the band's sound, but of her personal mythology. Her stage presence and growing media spotlight began to eclipse the rest of the group, including longtime member Christine McVie, whose contributions were just as crucial. While Christine continued to deliver radio-friendly hits like Don't Stop and You Make Loving Fun, her quieter presence stood in contrast to Stevie's rapid ascent as a cultural icon. Christine later admitted in interviews that she did, at times, feel a sense of jealousy as Stevie's fame skyrocketed. However, she was also quick to frame it as a passing feeling, one she ultimately accepted for the good of the band. The jealousy, she implied, was never acted upon and never verbalized directly to Stevie. Yet, even subtle, unspoken tensions can leave a mark. As Christine's spotlight dimmed in comparison, she began to retreat further from the public eye, reinforcing her identity as the steady, behind-the-scenes architect of Fleetwood Mac's polished sound. Meanwhile, Stevie's image continued to grow beyond the band, even during their shared success. Stevie put it out there in later years that she did sense a quiet undercurrent of bitterness from Christine during the whole rumors thing. Nothing much was said, but she felt there was a strain in the air now and then, a strain caused not by open arguments, but by energy that was very much different from its normal charge. According to Stevie, Christine's feeling was never turned into a weapon and never put in her face. Rather, it was something that could be felt between the lines of conversation, a subtle shift in tone, or an occasional glance that meant everything. There was still great friendship between them, but the emotional flow between them changed a touch less fluid, a touch more cautious. This shift in dynamics was bound to affect their working relationship. As Stevie became the group's public mascot, rumors circulated about Christine's recession from collaboration opportunities. She withdrew further into her solitary writing space as a means to possibly assert her creative independence. The musical collaboration continued, but the unseen weight of fame imbalance had reconstituted its foundation. From there, it became ever so slightly unbalanced in terms of mutual respect and unspoken sensitivity. As two women accommodated each other's changing roles in the spotlight, neither could very much control. Romance through separate eyes. When it came to love, Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie lived and wrote from very different emotional landscapes. While both endured heartbreak and complicated romances, their responses to those experiences revealed strikingly different temperaments. Stevie, known for her poetic lyricism and emotional vulnerability, poured her heartbreak into sweeping metaphors and mystical themes. Christine, more grounded and reserved, translated her romantic experiences into direct, melodic expressions that often carried a hint of detachment. Their divergent approaches to love, both in life and in song, added a compelling duality to Fleetwood Mac's catalog and subtly influenced how they related to each other within the band. One of Christine's most talked-about relationships was with Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Their romance, which spanned the late 70s into the early 80s, was reportedly chaotic and emotionally exhausting. Christine once described the relationship as a roller coaster, and it's believed to have inspired her song, Only Over You. Written with Wilson in mind, the track carried a bittersweet tone, capturing both affection and disillusionment. Unlike Stevie's grand emotional portraits, Christine's lyrics often reflected love through a lens of quiet resignation and personal boundaries. Her method of channeling pain was elegant, almost minimalistic, an approach that Stevie reportedly admired, though they never openly discussed it. Stevie's own romance misfortune, particularly that of the breakup with Lindsey Buckingham, affected not only her writing, but also her identity within Fleetwood Mac. Dreams, Silver Springs, and later solo work like Has Anyone Ever Written Anything for You bring out the most accessible artist so closely linked to emotional storytelling. All that happened to her resonated in every chord, every line, every haunting harmony. Stevie wrote his music like a badge of pain-open, raw, and endlessly introspective. Her reaction to romantic loss, in comparison to Christine's, was sprawling. It was weighed down, layered with longing, and often laced with the achieved but unresolved grief. Whereas Christine quietly closed emotional doors, Stevie left them swinging open in invitation to coalesce with her storm. This aforementioned emotional disparity ultimately gave way to undercurrents of tension between the two female entities. Rumors suggested that Stevie had times when she would find Christine's practical approach to love and songwriting somewhat emotionally challenged, while Christine may think of Stevie's emotional upheaval into romantic entanglement as being melodramatic or even self-absorbed. These were not very public conflicts, but did shade their emotional rhythm. Friends, they stood by each other. Artists, they suffered in parallel, and never quite emotionally converged. Their loves defined losses, and different losses shaped two distinct traditions of music, revised and edited into a common iconic sound. When love crossed boundaries. Fleetwood Mac's history is famously steeped in romantic entanglements, many of which directly inspired their most iconic songs. Among them was Christine McVie's 1976 affair with the band's lighting director, Curry Grant. At the time, she was still married to bassist John McVie, making the relationship a point of inner band tension. Instead of hiding the experience, Christine immortalized it in the upbeat and breezy "You Make Loving Fun." The song, wrapped in optimism and catchy hooks, stood in stark contrast to the turmoil surrounding it. Christine's ability to extract something light-hearted from a morally complicated situation spoke volumes about her emotional pragmatism. For her, love, even messy love, was often just another part of life to be processed, lived through, and turned into melody. In contrast, Stevie Nicks approached love with almost spiritual reverence. For Stevie, romantic connection wasn't just personal. It was transformative, mystical, and often devastating. Her songs are layered with symbolism, often treating heartbreak as an existential wound rather than a mere emotional hurdle. Storms, one of Stevie's most vulnerable pieces, is saturated with sorrow and ambiguity, offering a poetic meditation on betrayal and loss. While Christine could sing about a new lover with playful ease, Stevie would turn similar experiences into mythic laments, dissecting the pain and meaning behind every broken promise. This fundamental difference in their romantic philosophies ran deeper than lyrics. It reflected how they each coped with the emotional chaos surrounding the band. The contrast in mood between "You Make Loving Fun" and "Storms" signifies the chasm in emotion separating the two women. While Christine's tune bursts with cheer-reflecting glee, it also comes wrapped in a few lines that sound flippant, an attempt at celebrating newfound love unapologetically. Whereas this one seems nothing but ethereal and painful, full of metaphors and unhealed issues. Not only are they stylistic differences, but also two reflections of personal ideology. Christine, then, would see affairs as framed by all the messiness of life and love. For Stevie, usually, these are perceived through a moral, emotional lens that requires some looking deep within oneself for the reckoning. There are rumors that all that Christine's very easy framing of infidelity might have sounded somewhat emotionless to Stevie, especially during that time when the band was already hurtling along with so many messy breakups and entangled loyalties. These opposing views created a quiet, philosophical divide between Stevie and Christine. While they never confronted each other over their differing approaches to love, those differences quietly shaped how they navigated personal relationships and songwriting. And in a band where almost everyone had been romantically involved with one another, the two girls had very different reactions to affairs. For Christine, love was just a point in time. Savor it while it lasts. For Stevie, however, love was a sacred thing, and the wound was one that required contemplation before healing. The very affairs that surrounded them didn't just shape the band, but drew out a subtle yet lasting divide between two women joined by harmony, yet splintered by heart-splitting concerns. Champagne and quiet judgments. Fleetwood Mac's success in the 1970s came with a heavy price, a lifestyle deeply entangled with substance, alcohol, and excess. Christine McVie once made a strikingly candid remark about this period, saying that champagne and made me perform better. Her tone, often marked by dry humor and British understatement, suggested a kind of functional indulgence, one where substance use was simply part of the job. Christine's view seemed to reflect a sense of control, or at least detachment, from the darker aspects of the band's notoriously chaotic backstage culture. To many, her comment was more reflective than confessional, a light nod to an era that left scars on everyone, but which she seemed to discuss without visible remorse. For Stevie Nicks, however, the story was different. Her substance use, especially became one of the defining struggles of her career. In interviews years later, Stevie described her descent into addiction as emotionally and physically devastating. She spoke of the intense loneliness, the health scares, and eventually the intervention that led her to check into the Betty Ford Clinic. Her tone in these reflections was never glib. She often emphasized the seriousness of what she endured and the lasting toll it took on her voice, her relationships, and her spirit. Stevie's journey through addiction was one of pain and eventual reckoning, something that she carried with deep emotional weight even decades after her recovery. From this, tension reportedly came between Christine's casual acknowledgement and Stevie's harrowing recollections. Although there was no formal confrontation, there were whispers that Stevie sometimes felt Christine downplayed the gravity of what they had gone through. Christine's detachment may have unintentionally made Stevie feel isolated in her suffering, as if the emotional wreckage she carried was considered something other people brushed off. In a way, Christine's mouth may get tired from Stevie bringing all this emotional weight from the past into discussions. The very fact that one tone is light and the other's somber reflects not only an experienced difference, but also how they process trauma as well. Trust and vulnerability are tenuous in any group and fragile, especially when formed in such high-stakes environments. Stevie, who needed much emotional reassurance and understanding, might have found Christine's seeming detachment difficult to deal with. On the other hand, Christine is the quieter, sometimes more reserved type of person who probably found Stevie's outgoingness and emotional intensity hard to accept. Their musical partnership was strong, while the emotional support they could provide each other was clearly uneven. In a band best known for its harmony, perhaps the greatest dissonance came from subtle judgments below the surface. The emotional distance wasn't just felt backstage, it followed them into the studio, where harmony often masked a quiet, creative divide, creating contradiction. Inside the studio, where magic and madness often coexisted, Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie brought wildly different creative energies. Stevie, known for her intuitive and abstract approach, often arrived with poems, fragments of melodies, and a vision that wasn't always linear. Her process was driven by feeling rather than formula, guided by instinct and emotional current rather than structure. She would frequently record stream-of-consciousness demos and shape them into full songs during the production process. Her songs were dreamlike and symbolic, often requiring extra effort from the band to interpret and refine. This made her a mystical force in the studio, both inspiring and, at times, difficult to pin down. Christine, on the other hand, came from a more classically trained background and favored traditional songcraft. Her compositions were neat, melodic, and tightly structured, often complete when she brought them to the group. She had a knack for writing radio-friendly songs with clear hooks and compact arrangements. In contrast to Stevie's ethereal lyricism, Christine's lyrics were straightforward, emotional, yet grounded. While this made her a consistent contributor to the band's commercial success, it also put her at odds, quietly, with Stevie's more meandering process. Christine reportedly preferred order and efficiency in the studio, something that occasionally clashed with Stevie's need for creative space and improvisation. Though the two seldom seemed to argue openly, Walters often heard rumors of misalignments during studio work. Christine and Stevie's disagreements revolved around differences in opinion that did not include loud screaming matches or dramatic confrontations, such as deciding on harmonies, getting what they wanted from studio time, or prioritizing tracks on albums. Christine could have become irritated if a session was not running according to plan, while Stevie probably resented it whenever Christine began to impose what she thought should be done on any given track. These divergent instincts often made collaboration feel something like playing in parallel and not working together in true partnership. While the more aggressive personalities in the group entertainers, such as Lindsey Buckingham, were often noticed for the fiery arguments, the arguments between Stevie and Christine stewed in silence under the surface. Compared to Fleetwood Mac's male cacophony, the quieter tension between Stevie and Christine, less visible but impactful, had its own pressure. The differences in their music may not have slain their friendship outright, but they did restrict its creative closeness. The women respected one another, but their creative processes were not always conducive to deep cooperation. Instead, they came to creative coexistence, two powerful songwriters working independently toward a collective legacy, each perceiving the band's identity through individual lenses. The harmony was there, but behind it lay quiet compromises, skipped beats, and a creative tension that was never really resolved. The unspoken rift. In 1998, Christine McVie made the decision to step away from Fleetwood Mac, citing a growing fear of flying and the cumulative toll of decades on the road. After years of grueling tours, internal strife, and personal heartbreaks, she simply needed a break from the chaos, from the stage, and perhaps from the emotional weight of the band itself. To many, her departure seemed calm and rational, a quiet exit rather than a dramatic fallout. But for Stevie Nicks, the decision cut deeper. Though publicly supportive, Stevie would later hint that Christine's absence felt like more than just a logistical gap. It felt like a personal loss. Rumors suggest that Stevie interpreted Christine's exit not just as a career move, but as a kind of abandonment. As the only woman left in the band, Stevie suddenly bore the full weight of Fleetwood Mac's complex dynamic alone, both musically and emotionally. Their sisterhood, once a source of solidarity in a male-dominated group, had been fractured by silence. There was no fight, no dramatic goodbye, just absence. And in that quiet distance, Stevie reportedly felt the ache of losing not only a collaborator, but a confidant. It wasn't until much later that she expressed how much she had relied on Christine's calming presence amid the band's storms. What lent poignance to the chasm was its silence. While Stevie's violent blowout sessions with Lindsey Buckingham put an end to many things, The invisible wound with Christine never had closure. There were no splashed headlines, no interview mudslinging, just faded contact for years, passing mentions here and there, until the space between them became indiscernibly engulfed with growing emotional distance. It was as if silence had inflicted a deeper wound than the confrontation would have. Denied any chance of articulating her pain or confusion, the rhythm of their relationship was forever interrupted, unfinished, and emotionally unresolved. Stevie, the quintessential poet of heartbreak, had to carry within herself all the things she did not get to say. That moment was actually one that fans celebrated, though it was mixed with feelings for Stevie when Christine finally joined the band again in 2014. In public, she embraced her back, but emotionally, a different landscape took shape. The years of separation could not be erased, and the togetherness they once shared had faded. Although they performed together again, the sisterhood that once anchored them had softened into something more professional, less personal. Their relationship survived, but the silence between 1998 and 2014 lingered like a shadow, a quiet rift born not of anger, but of unspoken wounds that time never quite healed. Tension beneath the spotlight. Live performances have always been a defining element of Fleetwood Mac's identity. But beneath the polished harmonies and packed arenas, there were moments when tension simmered just out of view. One such moment came during a 1986 concert, when Lindsey Buckingham reportedly kicked Stevie Nicks on stage, in what was described by witnesses as a brief but jarring act of aggression. While the incident didn't erupt into a full-blown altercation, it symbolized the emotional volatility lingering from their broken relationship. What stood out for Stevie, according to rumors, was not just the act itself, but Christine McVie's silence in its aftermath. Stevie, already under public scrutiny, reportedly felt alone in that moment, both physically and emotionally. Throughout Fleetwood Mac's touring years, Stevie often carried the emotional weight of onstage drama. Her past with Buckingham frequently spilled into their performances, making their interactions charged and unpredictable. While Mick Fleetwood, or John McVie, might absorb conflict with stoicism, Christine's quiet presence became a double-edged sword. On one hand, she was a calming force in the band. On the other, her neutrality could feel like emotional distance. Stevie, who thrived on emotional connection and often sought support in times of turmoil, was said to have felt isolated when Christine failed to outwardly acknowledge or respond during public moments of tension. Christine was famous for her calm demeanor during performances and in life. She preferred to stay away even when confrontation was warranted. The neutrality that won her so many fans may occasionally have been construed as indifference. Whenever tempers flared amidst the band, whether during rehearsals, interviews, or live shows, Christine's unwillingness to get involved was often read as a self-preservation instinct. In those moments of discord, Stevie may well have interpreted Christine's stance as a show of disloyalty or lack of emotional support, particularly when Stevie felt vulnerable or singled out. It wasn't betrayal, but neither was it the kind of sisterly support Stevie sometimes craved. In mentioning that even the subtle cues on stage reinforced the emotional distance, fans have speculated about the moments when Christine put herself closer to the rest of the band, or appeared emotionally not present during Stevie's more intense moments. Those might be pure coincidences, or merely examples of a veteran performer holding himself together. For Stevie, who placed a heavy emotional attachment to chemistry on stage, those signs were hard to ignore. Over time, it all began to add up into an almost secret sense of distance. The feeling that when the lights were on and the heat was building up, she was alone. Not because Christine was against her, but because Christine was not with her either. the comeback felt cold. When Christine McVie officially rejoined Fleetwood Mac in 2014 after a 16-year absence, the announcement was met with overwhelming enthusiasm from fans and fellow band members alike. Her return was seen as a homecoming, restoring a classic lineup that had been incomplete since her quiet departure in 1998. The band launched a massive world tour shortly after, with Christine seamlessly stepping back into her role as keyboardist and vocalist. To the public, it appeared that time had healed old wounds, and the legendary partnership between her and Stevie Nicks was back in full swing. But beneath the surface, the emotional landscape was more complicated than the set list suggested. In interviews following the reunion, Stevie Nicks spoke positively about Christine's return, but with a noticeable air of caution. While she expressed happiness about having her friend and fellow songwriter back, her tone often hinted at unresolved feelings. She admitted that the band felt more complete with Christine in it, but she also confessed that the reunion came with emotional baggage. Rumors began to circulate that Stevie felt blindsided by Christine's decision to rejoin the band after so many years of silence. Some even claimed that Stevie had questions about the timing and motivation behind Christine's return, questions that were never fully addressed between them. In their public reunion, for sure, there was no mention of the gaping emotional distance that had evolved during so many years apart. Though they stood together on stage for the first time in ages, one wondered whether there had ever been a personal confrontation, a private speech from a sincere heart-to-heart that would have filled the silence over the last 15 years. Public interviews as well as semi-private occasions remained pleasant, but thankfully, sometimes intimately warm, just not in a way they ever used to be. Now it seemed like the reunion was merely to be a revival of the Fleetwood Mac trademark, rather than an effort to revive a friendship the band once closely centered upon. One could hear the music fine, but that emotional groove with Stevie and Christine was just a bit out of sync. Stevie was probably used to such emotional candor and such deep personal connections that it would have been difficult for her to simply pick up on whatever had gone on before. Christine, always careful and pragmatic, had felt free just to move on. This difference in emotional processing left a chasm between the two that nothing would professionally mask. The reunion had been a triumph for the band, but for Stevie, it must have been something much more bittersweet. A reconciliation based on logistics rather than healing, where the music came back, but the friendship was stuck in an even quieter, unresolved space. Some distances fade with time. Others grow louder in the silence they leave behind. Farewell, regret, and unfinished business. When Christine McVie passed away in November 2022, it sent a wave of grief through the music world, but perhaps nowhere was the loss felt more deeply than by Stevie Nicks. In the immediate aftermath, Stevie shared a handwritten tribute on social media that was both raw and intimate. She referred to Christine as her best friend in the whole world since the first day of 1975, and quoted lyrics from Haim's Hallelujah, a song about losing someone you never imagined life without. The letter read like a combination of a eulogy and a confession, as if Stevie were trying to reach Christine through the weight of her own sorrow. It was a beautiful, poetic gesture, but it also revealed how much had been left unsaid between them. In the weeks following the tribute, Stevie reportedly admitted in private circles, and later hinted in interviews that she hadn't had the chance to say goodbye. Christine's illness had been kept relatively quiet, and by the time the end came, there hadn't been time for final conversations or emotional closure. Stevie's grief, layered with that regret, took on a tone of helplessness. Mourning not just a person, but the missed opportunity to resolve lingering distance. though they had reunited musically in 2014 and performed together for. Several years afterward, their bond had never fully returned to the emotional closeness of their early days. The years of silence, misalignments, and emotional restraint were never truly unpacked. The painful epiphany that their last chapter was not one of complete healing had lingered in Stevie's mind following Christine's death. Rumors abound that she was particularly anguished at the thought of having missed a final talk, never reviewing the years that had quietly torn at their sisterhood. They had stood on stage together. Personally, their relationship had remained somewhat formal, never really returning to that deep emotional space they had once shared. For someone whose whole life has been filtered through lyrics and reflection, this lack of resolution for Stevie only compounded her pain. She had lost a partner, a bandmate, but a fragment of her story now seemed unfinished. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Stevie and Christine's untold story, give it a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind the music moments. And hey, don't go anywhere. Click the next video on your screen for another twist in the Fleetwood Mac saga.